Why? Good morning, Jake.
Why, good morning to you also, Greg.
Isn't it a wonderful day in our glorious country of Australia today?
Isn't it? Yes, indeed. I am so glad that we started this podcast so that we could discuss the hard-hitting political topics happening in Australia today.
Yes, I too am also glad that we started this podcast to discuss the positive and negative undertakings of our hard-working and not so hard-working politicians who I am sure...
Toilet paper!
Damn it. Hello and welcome to episode 14 of The Pouch, the exploding cane toad of podcasts that aims to help anyone who has set foot in this sunburnt country try and make sense of their current political environment. I'm Greg, probably take up a trade just because I feel so bad savage.
And I'm Jake, the Reserve Banker Chickens Far Wharton. On today's episode, we talk helicopter treasuring, ambassadorships, truth-telling, and snowflakes in autumn.
And Jake, while we are in this pouch and we are snug as a bug in a rug, I want you to help me understand the acronym ICAC and what it means for Australia and Australians in general.
Spoiler alert, I don't know.
Well, we nearly made it, Jake. I mean, we nearly made it to what, 40 seconds in the podcast before we mentioned toilet paper?
Yeah.
It's been tough. You've said the words now, so the toilet paper genie has appeared. It's out of the proverbial toilet and into the fire, and it's been tough. I was speaking to our producer Johnny before the show today, and he said, guys, we'll try not to mention the words toilet paper or coronavirus, neither of which are particularly political, but particularly the toilet paper stuff. But it seems like we won't be able to get around it. The biggest problem is the smoke is gone, the fires are out, the heat is gone. It's no longer 40 degrees. In the Blue Mountains here today, it's
Greg,
raining.
those are big problems.
It's a big, those, they're all gone, right? But I shouldn't have anything to worry about. Yet here I am. I'm panicking about toilet paper of all things.
Yeah. Because of COVID-19.
There's no way to make it sound snappy, is there? Now,
No.
Jake, so I said to our producer, I said, look, how about instead we don't dedicate entire segments to toilet paper. We just, we get it out of the way because we're going to have to mention it.
And then never mention again.
Our listeners expect it, right? However, yeah. We will make a presumption that they're also getting their news from other outlets. I'm
not willing to make that presumption, Greg.
That no one's waiting for the episode of The Pouch to launch this week so that they can get their all of their week's news.
Give me my news crack, please.
I'm going to set a timer, Jake. And what did we agree on? How long?
20 seconds.
Okay, so you've got 20 seconds to sum up for me. I've been hiding in the pouch all week. I have no idea what's going on. So tell me in 20 seconds what's been happening with this whole toilet paper coronavirus situation. All right, I have 20 seconds.
On the
clock. Are you ready? Okay.
I'm ready. Start the clock. TP has gone from shelves despite a lack of scarcity. People are panic purchasing it all, creating a panic in those who need it. Woolies and Coles have instituted a 4-pack maximum, which is roughly a 3-month supply. And as of writing this, around 7,000 people have been asked to self-quarantine, which won't work because people need money to live. The PM estimates $1 billion worth of costs. I got there.
We do actually have some news that has happened this week, and so Jake, I want you to kick us off by talking about there's a bit of a continuation here from we covered this story a few weeks ago. Do you want to give us a bit of a background before we launch into it?
So yes, a couple of weeks ago, the Director General of ASIO, Mike Burgess, came out and warned that Australia is experiencing at all levels greater heightened security due to threats, both domestic and abroad. And he pointed to domestic threats related to extreme right-wing terrorists. He said that people are saluting Nazi flags, that they're looking at weapons, just inspecting them, just looking at them, not using them, but they're also training in combat and to spread hate. Now, the most recent, I suppose, activity around this story is that Liberal Senator Conchita Fierravanti-Wells has attacked Australia's Domestic Intelligence Chief Mike Burgess for using the term, quote, right-wing, whilst warning of the growing threat of right-wing extremism, saying that it offended conservative. But yes, the speech deliberately and repeatedly used the descriptors extreme right-wing, differentiating the threat from mainstream political beliefs. But the comments appear to have caused offence among some sections of the Liberal Party. For example, Fierravanti-Wells confronted Burgess during Senate estimates hearing on earlier this week on Monday, complaining of the use of the word right. Probably also wings. She's not a big fan of denigrating our birds, flightless or otherwise.
Especially the ones that are endangered at the moment because of the bushfires. I mean,
exactly.
Come on.
Let's have some extreme sensitivity here.
Yeah, that's right. Next year we're using fur, claws.
Those extremist right clawers. Yeah, they're the worst. They're the worst. But she said, quote, I'm concerned about this and concerned about the use of terminology of right. Right is associated with conservatism in this country, and there are many people of conservative background who take exception with being charred with the same brush. I think she meant tarred, but she definitely meant she definitely said charred.
Again, look, offensive because of the bushfires, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Now, look,
I'm just not sure how you get charred with a brush, though.
I kind of see where this point is coming from in the sense that, we've seen in the United States that left-wing people often conflate right-wing with extreme right-wing in the sense that as soon as you come out and say that you support anything to do with Donald Trump, you're not smart, you're a loser, you're an extremist, you're a racist, that there's absolutely nothing good that he can do. And I think that the point here would be not to go down that same path. So, for example, I get a bit nervous on the show sometimes because I often say I quite like what Scott Morrison did in X, X, and Y. And it's a difficult thing to say. I get nervous before I say it because I think, gosh, I'm going to get an email or a letter or a pigeon's
here comes the lefty scorn.
Yeah. Well, I guess, that's the thing. And I guess I feel the same if I was to go to the left and say, hey, man, Anthony Albanese's the best. And gosh, he's just, he just does all this great stuff. I would worry about the sort of backlash from that. So I think it's going to be really important moving forward that we're able to have a conversation and say, well, actually, you know what? Not everything that Scott Morrison does is bad. Not everything that the Conservative government does is bad. We still live in an absolutely tremendous country and we shouldn't take that for granted. And I suppose that's probably her point in that using the words right-wing all the time kind of gives people a bit of ammunition against people who they disagree with politically.
Yeah, so I suppose the major point here is that when Mike Burgess, the Director General of ASIO, was talking about extreme right-wing groups, they were talking about people who are essentially on the road towards creating at least a mini terrorist cell, a bit of a sleeper cell, if you like, waiting to do something, But that's sort of the point. You point out the threats, and maybe they were wrong to say extreme right wing. Instead, they maybe should have said Nazi groups.
Yeah, just like extremists in general.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the way that this has been clarified by a few senior leaders in the Liberal Party is probably the most effective way, which is they've essentially said, doesn't matter whether you're on the left, doesn't matter whether you're on the right, it doesn't matter where you sit on the political spectrum. If you commit a crime, if you are planning to commit a terrorist act, we will find you and we will get you.
Yes. I heard a really interesting podcast this week. It was the 7 a.m. podcast podcast. I know that you listen to that as well, Jake. And for our listeners, if you haven't checked that out, you could check that out. They had a whole episode this week dedicated to Scott Morrison and his trouble with telling the truth. Let's elaborate on that a little bit. Do we live in a post-truth era with our friend Scott Morrison?
It's a good question, and I suppose, Greg, if I can throw that back on you, if I were to tell you that the Prime Minister came out this week to come clean on a part lie, part obfuscation, what would you think that he has come clean on?
Well, it's first of all, it's a little unfair because we're not allowed to mention toilet paper, or TP as Beavis and Butthead used to call it. So we're not allowed to mention TP. So the only thing I can think of is probably, I don't know, something to do with plummeting Bitcoin stocks. Is he single-handedly sabotaging Bitcoin stocks? My Bitcoin stocks.
Well, actually, he is doing that. Do you have Bitcoin?
No, I don't have Bitcoin stocks.
I was going to say.
Goodness me.
That's very funny.
You think I'd be doing this podcast if I had Bitcoin stocks? Actually, I'll take that back. Do you think I'd be doing this podcast in my shed if I had Bitcoin stocks?
No, I'd have my own external mansion to record the podcast in. Yes. So this week, it was quite interesting. This week, the Prime Minister sat down for a chat with one of Australia's premier political journalists, Lee Sale. He was grilled about a perception of, at best, excessive secrecy, and at worst, a bit of a trouble with truthfulness. So the examples that Lee Sales cited were, number one, the many emails between the Prime Minister's office and Bridget McKenzie's office over the selection of the sports infrastructure grant recipients, particularly in the lead up to the election last year. There were emails flying backwards and forwards on the day that the election was called, which is essentially when when all action grinds to a halt. There's a moratorium, so they try to slip this stuff through essentially beforehand. Exactly. And the second one was around that case of the trip to Hawaii, which was kept secret from everyone, including notably the Deputy Prime Minister, who probably should have been told that he was the acting Prime Minister during that time. And then finally, this week, the Prime Minister announced that he had nominated the head pastor of the Hillsong Church, Brian Houston, to attend a state dinner at the White House. So the PM had, at the time and for some months, had been saying that he did not put forward Houston's name, and he came clean this week that he, in fact, did put Houston's name forward, saying that essentially it was such a minimal issue. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. I blocked freedom of information requests because, look, it's just, guys, focus on something else.
In that report, they said that his office blocked it, citing security concerns.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Not sure what that's security related to.
No, I would argue that having a prime minister who lies to his to the country is probably a little more of a security threat than inviting Brian Houston to a dinner.
Yeah, I tend to agree. In general, I personally think that it is probably the purview of Prime Minister and Cabinet.
Were you going to say crapnet?
I don't. Crapnet. I tried really hard.
He's going to launch into the crap.
into the crapnet. No, I. The thing is, there are things that go on that you and I will either never hear about, or we'll hear about, 20 years down the track when things are declassified. And that's okay. Those things actually do relate to national security. I definitely don't. I mean, we've talked a couple of times about the so-called pub test. What happens when you put this case to your average Australian human being in a pub? Or in any setting, really. Frankly, I don't think this one passes the pub test as a national, as something that should be blocked because of national security thing. But this whole premise is that it establishes at least it looks like it establishes a pattern. When the Prime Minister was questioned on this, pattern of obfuscation or flat out lies, the PM simply deflected, which was.
Well, it's a great time to come out at the moment and sort of admit to a few lies, isn't it? Because you can say, look, I'm not, because then when you get grilled, I mean, this is exactly what he did. As soon as he was targeted about these lies, he said, look, I'm not focused on that, Lee. That doesn't bother me. What bothers me is making sure that Australia's prepared for coronavirus and that we get the bushfire relief going, that we get the stimulus package sorted. Gosh, I'm not worried about these lies. I don't know why you keep harping on about these lies.
Why are you making such a big deal out of this thing that I made into such a big deal? Okay.
I'm going to hark back to our old friend Sam Harris, who wrote a book called Lying, and it's a fantastic read, very, very short read if you haven't read it, and basically about how much trust is eroded in a relationship purely from what you might consider even white lies. So you have these enormous lies that people just have no idea what to deal with, how to deal with these enormous lies that some politicians tell. However, it's these little lies, these little white lies that will erode relationships between you and your spouse, because you can't, or you and your politicians, because you can't. If you can't trust them on those small things, how can you possibly trust them on the big things? And I can feel that. I want to be able to say with confidence that, yes, these things are, Scott Morrison's not all evil and that Scott Morrison is doing some, wonderful things and his cabinet is doing some wonderful things. That makes it really, really hard to spark that conversation when people can just turn around and go, well, look, he's constantly lying about really small things. So how could you possibly trust him on these big things?
Yeah. You're so right. And I mean, I think that broadly speaking, I think at this stage, the general public has turned off, this conversation in the public sphere. They just don't care because it is such a minimal thing, and we've got bigger things on the, on the horizon, and certainly in the present tense around COVID-19. But the fact is that this does establish a pattern. On the face of it, it establishes a pattern of, the Prime Minister feeling that it's okay to lie to the public, which is really not fair. It's okay.
He did say that he could handle it, that if he had his time over again, he'd handle it differently.
Yeah.
But there's only so far that you can go with apologies as well, isn't there?
Well, especially when he's establishing now a pattern of saying I could have handled things differently. Because, there's the Brian Houston thing, okay, could have handled that differently. There's the going to Hawaii, could have handled that differently. There's the awkward handshakes while he's trying to visit, towns that have been acutely affected by bushfires. I could have handled that differently. Yeah, you could have handled a whole lot of things differently. That is entirely true. If you spend a bit of time strategizing before you do something instead of doing the Trump thing and just opening your mouth and allowing the brain to connect with the mouth, it's a bit of tactical initiative that may save you from saying, I could have handled that differently in the future. But what I'd like to know is, what do the listeners think?
Yes.
Are we experiencing a trust deficit, if you like?
Yeah.
And have the latest few months impacted that potential trust deficit, both in Parliament in general, but more acutely with the Prime Minister?
Jake, I want a helicopter.
Who doesn't? Well, actually, I don't. I can't fly a helicopter, so I'm afraid that it would become a relic.
I presume that the helicopter comes with a person who can fly it. I think you call them pilots.
Oh, okay. All right. Oh, that's good. It sparks up employment.
I don't presume that I buy a helicopter and I just have to learn how to fly it.
Well,
I want to be able to get into the helicopter, and I want to be able to just say, look, take me to Japan, and not Japan at the moment. Take me to, I don't know, New Zealand.
Take me to somewhere without COVID-19.
So, that's it. Ready? COVID-19. Wash your hands. How's that?
I love it. That's good.
Okay. Should we practice it? Ready? 1, 2, 3.
COVID-19. Wash your hands.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was great. We were on fleek.
I think we're on trend. All right, Jake, I want a helicopter.
So who doesn't want a helicopter, Greg? And this week it seems like, or rather not this present week, but it looks like next week we are going to hear about a bit of helicopter stimulating. Or, well,
Good.
actually, maybe that's a bit risque. Helicopter treasuring by way of a stimulus measure. Maybe that's too descriptive.
So what is helicopter treasuring? Is this what you do when there's too much coronavirus around, so you can't like get in your limo anymore? You just have to helicopter the papers into Parliament.
We call that transport by Bronwyn Bishop. Oh, zing! That's a historical. Oh, yes, how droll.
Head to Wikipedia, friends.
So yes, this week the Reserve. You might need to. You might need to.
I took that opportunity to have a drink. It was terrible timing on my part.
Yes, this week the Reserve Bank went into uncharted territory, looking on the fiscal outlook for Australia with severe consternation. They made the largely unprecedented action to cut the official interest rate by 25 basis points to 0.5%. And this is being cited as being due to continued stagnant growth, the growing unemployment rate and underemployment rate as well, and coronavirus. I mean, COVID-19. Wash your hands. Yeah, that was very good. So they essentially said that you've closed the borders to tourists. So this is the conversation that the Reserve Bank has with the Australian Parliament. Essentially, they said, "Look, guys, you've closed the borders to tourists and to students, which are two major sectors that account for up to 5% of economic growth and are expected to fall by 10%. And China is still reeling from COVID-19 and may slow commodity imports. And we may see domestic slowdown due to people's fears of congregating in public areas. So what are we going to do about it? My thought is, and the thought of many commentators out this week, is helicopter in some sexy stimulus.
But
maybe that was overplayed. But I love that. I love that. That's great.
Oh no, I think everyone's excited about this. I mean, look, the clue is in the title, Jake. It's called stimulus.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And it's there really, and it's one of those things. The stimulus is often, particularly when Liberal and National governments are in power, stimulus measures are often thought of quite negatively, and that is because Liberal National Party, certainly they like to think that they are the conservators of rational and measured economic action. And when you're in a stimulus phase, you are trying to do as much as you possibly can to spend as much money to essentially stimulate the economy. So bring forward major infrastructure projects, give money back to businesses, and the whole idea of this is to keep people employed, to prevent unemployment from rising. Because when people get unemployed, the government has to take care of them anyway through the social safety net, etc.
Okay.
But having them gainfully employed, having them gainfully employed is a much more productive way to do that, because not only do they have gainful employment, they have social interaction. They're less prone to those depressive states that are quite prevalent when unemployment does hit. They are actually earning money, which they will use to spend on goods and services and other things in order to, further stimulate the economy. So it is an important thing.
Yeah, and I reckon we wait for the announcement of the stimulus package. We might even do a bonus episode on it when it comes out because it is tremendously exciting. I think a point here is that when I think of stimulus package, I think I think of Kevin Rudd, and we got his stimulus package, didn't we? We got the so-called, well, I mean, where I lived anyway at the time, it was the so-called Xbox stimulus. Everyone went out and bought an Xbox or a big 1080p TV at the time. I think people are kind of on their edge of their seat thinking that maybe we might get something like that, but you're saying maybe not so much.
Yeah, look, it's very unlikely. So in 2008, I think it was, the Rudd government enacted their stimulus measures, which included, much as I said there, several major infrastructure projects, several cuts to business taxes and obligations, and they had this. I think it was somewhere between $200 and $400. Every adult citizen received essentially a bank check for $200 or $400. I can't remember the exact amount.
Wasn't it more than that? I thought we got more than that.
Look, it may have been slightly more than that. There was, there's the old, or maybe you did. It was what do you call it? Measured on it was means tested.
Oh, was it? Okay, yeah.
It is possible. But
I was pretty mean at the time.
but it was a tremendous measure objectively because it got a lot of people to spend money.
Yes.
And that was at a time
still going.
when
so I'm still going.
Still spending money.
Been ahead of the game since 2008.
It is one of those things though that we went from relatively prosperous times to a global financial collapse at that time because that was during the global financial crisis. Whereas we're in a little bit of a different state now, where in Australia, most families are in record amounts of debt. So any money that goes to the individual is more likely to be spent on, well, A, toilet paper, and B, on paying down their own personal debt rather than on purchasing goods and services. So I think that's probably something that the Treasurer and Prime Minister are factoring into their decisions.
Well, I personally can't wait to find out about the stimulus package.
Me too.
Now, Jake, $347,000 over 3 years. Tell me if that is good enough. How did you
find out what I get paid?
That's right. And that's, and I've seen your tweets and you tweet more than 3 times, in the year. So I think you've actually earned that money. Some people, the Labor government has come out swinging against poor Scott Cam. Gosh, fancy dragging Scott Cam into politics like this.
I know, right?
Gosh, it's a risky thing, isn't it? And they've said it's not good enough. It's not good enough that he's got $347,000 and he's only got, over 3 years and he's only got one tweet and some Facebook update to show for it. Who is Scott Cam? I don't even know who he is.
Well, Scott Cam is one of the hosts of the award-winning Channel 7 show, The Block, or it might be a Channel 9 show. Frankly, I don't know.
Is it award-winning?
Yeah, and Scott Cam personally is a Gold Logie award-winning person as well.
Okay.
So he is a well-known Australian public figure, and I suppose in this area he's a well-known Australian tradie. Because he is on TV, he does talk about trades. He does, he's on a show where they are building structures and renovating houses, etc. So it was probably a good fit when late last year, in October last year, Scott Cam, as I said, the tradie from the Block, was selected to become a careers ambassador or ambassador even, in order to essentially get or stimulate the public. We're talking too much about stimulating. In order to get the public to take more interest and, I suppose, think more prosperous thoughts towards the premise of becoming a tradie, of taking up a trade. So Scott was brought on board and is being paid $347,000 for 18 months worth of this gig, and he's been paid already $145,000 of that, and he has made in total 3 short videos, 4 social media posts, and he put a profile on the government website.
All right. Well, okay, but hang on. To be fair, our producer, Johnny, he gets paid a little more than that, and he hasn't been too active on social media either, given the enormous, amounts of money that, I mean, look, my point here is that being an influencer is hard, right? You can't just start an Instagram account and get a whole bunch of people come and influence. Yep. You've got to do some stuff. Like, isn't October a bit too early? Like, from October to now, I mean, how are they measuring this? How many tradespeople have they got?
As well, we haven't seen an enormous increase. We haven't seen an increase at all, which is quite interesting. But a lot of that has to do with a lot of this has to do with the ease of getting into a trade, and it is always interesting that when you've got a jobs ambassador, that's often thought of as a one-way street. You talk to the public and you become the ambassador for bringing people in, but it probably should be a two-way thing, and particularly for an amount of money like this, it is an opportunity for Scott Cam even, to reach out to the Australian public, to people who might be interested in or might be thinking about going into trades, asking the Australian public, hey, tell me, what do you think is getting in the way of you starting a trade? And, that way the ambassadorship can become a two-way thing. The ambassadorship could become a two-way street where, Scott then advocates for Australia's, wannabe and to-be tradies for the government or to the government. So, it's just one of those things. This is a huge amount of money, with respect. It's not a massive amount of money in project terms, but in terms of bang for your buck, you want somebody who's going to go out there, help people to recognize that trades are a significant opportunity, not necessarily in the short term, but you are learning a really important skill from people who are, often the best in the business at what they do.
Hang on, Jake. Are you being paid by Scott Cam at the moment? Are you doing his job?
Maybe. No.
Now, look, that's exactly my question, right, is, and I think you were sort of leading up to this, I'm not sure, but my question is, who else are you going to choose? I mean, who else is a well-known tradie? Like, name someone else. I didn't even know he was a tradie, so now I know who he is and of him. I mean, this, the irony here, of course, is that he's got all this publicity this week, and so have trades, which is great. Yeah. So he's, I don't know any other tradesperson who could possibly fill his role. He's a businessman. So if you want a tradesperson to be the ambassador, you're going to have to offer them a fair chunk of money if they're already famous. I mean, he's not a dill, right? He's not going to do it for $50. No, I think
he's already done
I think he's already done a fair bit of volunteer work as well. He has come out and defended what he does and said that a lot of actually what he used to do before this was actually free of charge. And he's not going to knock back that money. I mean, he likes money just like the rest of us, and he's smart, obviously, and he's, career driven, and he is well known, and I can't think of anyone else who you could hire to do the job.
Yeah, so Greg, you are absolutely right, and there probably isn't anybody else that is a tradie and who has come as far in their career as Scott Cam. Out there today who can advocate for that. But I suppose this is the thing. He's being paid a rather large sum of money, and there is potentially more things that he can do. he could, for example, ambassadorship can work both ways. You can not only advocate for trades on behalf of the government, but you could also be an advocate for the general public, of people who might be interested in going into a trade, sending that information back to the government. For example, what do tradies need to do what does the government need to do in order to improve the intake of trades people into traineeships? What is required in order to smooth that way? So this ambassadorship could absolutely work both ways, and I feel that if he were to do something like that, at least there would be a perception that he's doing enough to earn that rather substantial salary.
Now, Jake, this thing keeps cropping up every now and again, and I don't really know what it is. I've been to the doctor, and he said, ask your friend Jake about it. And it's called an ICAC.
So an ICAC, apart from an itchy rash on the upper inner thigh region,
we're G-rated. G-rated.
An ICAC is an independent commission against corruption. Essentially an independent agency of the government that is there to find and stamp out instances of corruption. So both in Australia, both South Australia and New South Wales have an ICAC. And essentially the purpose is to preserve and promote integrity in public administration through proactive prevention and and educational initiatives. The investigation of corruption in public administration and investigation or referral of misconduct and maladministration in public administration.
So I can see, right? Yeah, well, I can see how this is coming up now because we talked about the trust that people have lost in the government, and also because of the sports rot situation, there seems to be a question of, well, what is going on and who is policing this?
Exactly, and that's maybe where an ICAC might find its home in the Commonwealth, in our Commonwealth government. So I'll give you a couple of examples of where the current examples of ICACs in South Australia and New South Wales have done some good. The South Australian branch had claimed a few scalps, including public servants. There was 6 police officers that lost their job for harassing and taking money. There was a South Australian Liberal MP, Troy Bell, who lost his job for various reasons, including dishonest dealing, malappropriation of goods, and maladministration of portfolios. In New South Wales, which is probably the most famous version of a independent commission against corruption, that brought down several high-profile ministers and government department heads, and also some private recipients of public project funding, such as New South Wales Water, that had some dealings with the government at the time, led by Barry O'Farrell. There was that major case of in the ICAC of Barry O'Farrell being asked, excuse me, Premier O'Farrell, did you happen to receive a bottle of Grange wine? That $3,000 or $4,000 wine? And did the New South Wales Water Company happen to receive certain approvals soon after that? So there were some high-profile scalps that were taken in the New South Wales iteration as well. As I mentioned, Barry O'Farrell, he lost his job, or more specifically, he resigned from his position over that bottle of Grange. There was also Eddie Obeid, quite a powerful power broker in New South Wales Parliament. And there are several examples of people like the New South Wales Police Minister, sector, mine operators, and several more that have been impacted by the institution of this ICAC.
So, am I right in it? Just summarising that, the idea is that at the moment we do have some independent commissions against corruption for the states, but not a federal one.
That is entirely correct, and I suppose there are some institutions within federal politics that do have the ability to, ask questions, hold audits, conduct commissions of audit, etc. Such as the Auditor General, who does have coercive powers to get people to both appear before before audits and to have compel people to answer questions.
He sounds like the type of person we need on the show to get people to write reviews for us on iTunes.
Yeah, absolutely. Coercive powers, that's what we need.
That's right, yeah.
So it's not as though we don't have anything out there to address these things, but essentially the Auditor General can take up cases based on their own whims, and while they are an independent part of the government, they are still part of the government. So it has been suggested in the past that they may not take up cases that are, sincerely non-favourable towards the government, or they may make findings that are, not so detrimental to the existing government. We want to think that these public institutions are, unbiased and unable, or rather, that they do look at things in a completely impartial manner. But as we've seen recently in the sports grants scandal, there was that under-emphasised link between the Prime Minister's office, emailing on the day that the election was called in order to settle those people who would get grants based on those areas or electorates that were, that the government was trying to pick up in the election. So there are things while the that audit did not necessarily find that any laws had been broken, which is quite significant in this case, considering there are a few instances there that, again, if you were to apply this to the pub test, that I think our general Australian citizens would find to be, quite on the nose, quite stinky.
Quite stinky.
Quite stinky indeed.
Sounds like someone needs some toilet paper.
Potentially. Yeah, let's not talk about that. But there has also been proposed a federal ICAC by the Greens. A bill was put before
that certainly
the Senate
sounds like something that
2019.
they would propose.
Exactly. And it failed. Well, it passed the Senate, but essentially it made it back to the House in order to be formulated as a bill,
It certainly
and
sounds
the government
like something that would fail as
anybody
well.
from voting on it.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, exactly. The government is not going to work with the Greens on something like this. It's the sort of thing that they want to have, complete oversight and control over. But the fact of the matter is the current government has proposed a type of anti-corruption commission, or a Commonwealth Integrity Commission, and that has gone through the lower house, but it's been percolating for months. Nothing seems to be happening on it. There are these organisations within the federal parliament that the government can use to look at, audit, and hold commissions on over the premise of corruption. But the question is, do they have the so-called teeth in order to bite down on corruption and appropriately address it, stamp it out, and munch it down and poop it out?
Well, I think they should get Scott Cam in charge of that as well. He seems to have some time on his hands. No pressure. I mean, just include that in his package, really. Just make sure you can stamp out corruption, have a quantifiable measure for corruption, and, set in place a whole bunch of consequences to make sure that it never happens again. No pressure.
Exactly. increase the amount of tradespeople or apprentices going into trades, and stamp out corruption in the federal government.
Speaking of representing the public, Jake, what do you want our listeners to do?
I would very much like for them to hit the subscribe button on their podcast player of choice and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook by searching for The Pouch, the podcast.
If you want to share the love, you can do so by telling your friends, family, and your foes to head to thepouchthepodcast.com, where they can subscribe using their favorite podcast player. Jake, thank you so much for speaking to me this week. Toilet paper. You ready to go?
GTG.
That doesn't take any more effort to say good to go. But as
same amount of syllables.
Yeah.
That's true.
As the listener, it takes way more conscious effort to figure out what the hell you meant by GTG. Like, is he misspelling my name? What's happening? Yeah.
That's why I did it.
You're a prime candidate for when they invent auto mowers, aren't you? Like, you're just going to sit there drinking, going, I'm mowing the yard, and it's just automatically happening via GPS.
Yeah. This is what I'm doing.
Elon Musk is just controlling your lawnmower.
One day, Greg.